Video provides an introduction to two starkly different types of regimes, democracy and dictatorship. I should note that I have lived under both types of regimes. I have lived in Uzbekistan, one of the most autocratic countries in the world, and like many of you, I call the United States, one of the world's democracies, home. Having spent time in an Uzbek jail after being detained on false charges, I must confess, I much prefer the freedoms and rights guaranteed by the U.S. democratic political regime. This video is divided into 4 parts. First, to ground our discussion, I provide definitions of 3 key concepts: the state, government, and regime. Next, I review 2 approaches, a procedural approach and a substantive approach for conceptualizing democracy. I then discuss how these 2 approaches map onto 3 leading measurements or indexes of democracy that political scientists often use. Lastly, I provide rubrics that we can use for evaluating how good our measurements of democracy, and, for that matter, measurements of any concept ultimately are. Let's review the key concepts of state, government, and regime. A state is an entity that uses coercion and the threat of force to rule a given territory. France is a state. Uzbekistan is a state. The United States is a state. A government is a set of people who run the state. They are the means through which state power is exercised. Examples of governments include the Obama administration and the current Congress, the Putin government in Russia, and Prime Minister Harper's government in Canada. A regime is a set of rules, norms, or institutions that determine how the government is constituted, organized, and major decisions are made. The world contains democratic regimes like the ones that exist in the United States, Sweden, and India, and authoritarian regimes like the ones that exist in Uzbekistan, North Korea, and Russia. One regime that many of you likely have first-hand experience with is democracy. Many of us have an intuitive sense of what democracy is. What would you say, though, if I asked you to articulate this intuition? Let me provide you with a few different conceptualizations of democracy. We might, for example, choose to adopt a substantive conceptualization of democracy. A substantive view classifies political regimes in terms of the outcomes that they produce. Does the regime produce freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion? Alternatively, we can adopt a procedural or minimalist view of democracy. Here we classify political regimes in terms of their institutions or procedures. In the case of democracy, for example, we could ask if elections are competitive and if all people can participate in elections. The difference in these conceptualizations is not simply one of language. If one were to adopt a proceduralist view of democracy, countries like the United States and Sweden would appear very similar. Regimes in both countries have at their core free and competitive elections. If one were to adopt a substantive view, however, people might begin to debate the nature of democracy. In the United States, much emphasis is placed on democracy's ability to produce equality of opportunity. We would all like to believe that, through hard work, we can achieve the American dream of wealth and prosperity. In many Northern European countries, however, the defining substantive outcomes of democracy is not equality of opportunity, but rather ensuring a high standard of living for all of its citizens. As you can imagine, the substantive view of democracy leads to heated debates about what governments should and should not do. Debates you likely are familiar with from watching U.S. politics. Noting these debates and their intractable nature, the political scientist Robert Dahl has encouraged us to adopt a procedural conceptualization of democracies and non-democracies. More specifically, Dahl encourages us to consider 2 procedural dimensions: inclusion and contestation. By inclusion, Dahl wants us to ask who gets to participate in politics. In many countries, not everyone gets to participate. Consider the United States. It has taken literally centuries for women and minorities to get the right to vote. In South Africa, the majority black population was denied the vote until the end of the apartheid era in 1994. The curious thing about both of these regimes is that even when inclusion was low, contestation, that is, competition between political parties, was high. We can equally identify regimes where inclusion is high but contestation is low. Regimes like the Soviet Union until 1991. Everyone was included, everyone could vote, but there was only one party, the Communist Party, to vote for. And there are regimes where both inclusion and contestation is low. Present-day Egypt under military rule is one such regime. And lastly, there are regimes like the present-day United States where both inclusion and contestation is relatively high. Dahl's two-dimensional procedural conceptualization of regime type, in short, can help us locate and compare all regimes in the world. Dahl's procedural conceptualization of regime type, you'll notice in this week's readings, is adopted by all three leading indexes political scientists use for comparing countries' political systems. Indeed, Dahl's conceptualization lies at the core of both the democracy-dictatorship measure and the polity-form measure reviewed in the textbook. Importantly, however, the Freedom House measure goes beyond Dahl's procedural approach to include a substantive, that is, outcome-based measurement of regime type. Adopting this substantive approach has implications for the kinds of questions we can ask using the Freedom House Index. The Chapter 5 problem set questions will help you explore this issue in greater detail. These differing approaches to measuring regime type raises the question, how do we evaluate our measures? When evaluating measures for regime type, or for that matter, any outcome we're interested in, we should always consider four questions. Is our conceptualization of the outcome in which we're interested correct? Are our measures valid? Are they reliable? And lastly, are our measures replicable? Conceptualization is the process of creating mental categories that capture the meaning of objects, events, or ideas. We can't always say if a conceptualization is right or wrong. For example, it would not make sense to ask if either a procedural or a substantive conceptualization of democracy is right or wrong. That said, we certainly can be clear in our conceptualizations. Dahl's two-dimensional conceptualization of regime type, for example, is very clear. The questions of reliability, validity, and replicability are more straightforward. A reliable measure is one that repeatedly and consistently produces the same score for a given case when we apply the same measurement processes. A reliable measure of democracy would be one in which several people, when given the same rules for measuring democracy, all produce the same democracy score for a given country. A valid measure is one in which our measures correspond to the concepts that they are intended to reflect. For example, if we wanted a valid measure of our weight, using our bathroom scale would probably make more sense than using the tape measure in our toolbox. Ideally, we want measures that are both reliable and valid. Imagine shooting arrows at a target. We might have an eye stigmatism. While we're reliable in our aim is always slightly off the mark. Similarly, we could have a valid measure, one that on average gives us the bullseye, but the bullseye is arrived at almost by chance, by spraying our arrows all over the target. Again, what is most desired are measures that consistently hit the bullseye, that are both reliable and valid. Lastly, we want measures that are replicable. We want any researcher, if provided with clear rules for how to take the measure, to be able to arrive at the same score. This means that we must be absolutely transparent in how we measure our concepts, so other researchers can easily follow in our footsteps. Admittedly, this is a tall order. We and our colleagues may not always hit the bullseye, but it's important to have a target worth shooting for.